Now we turn to the hardest philosopher we're going to read in this course. Today we turn to Immanuel Kant, who offers a different account of why we have a categorical duty to respect the dignity of persons and not to use people as means merely, even for good ends. Kant excelled at the University of Königsberg at the age of 16. At the age of 31, he got his first job as an unsalaried lecturer paid on commission based on the number of students who showed up at his lectures. This is a sensible system that Harvard would do well to consider. Luckily for Kant, he was a popular lecturer and also an industrious one, and so he eked out a meager living. It wasn't until he was 57 that he published his first major work. But it was worth the wait. The book was The Critique of Pure Reason, perhaps the most important work in all of modern philosophy. And a few years later, Kant wrote the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, which we read in this course. I want to acknowledge, even before we start, that Kant is a difficult thinker. But it's important to try to figure out what he's saying, because what this book is about is, well, it's about what the supreme principle of morality is, number one, and it's also, it gives us an account, one of the most powerful accounts we have, of what freedom really is. So let me start today. Kant rejects utilitarianism. He thinks that the individual person, all human beings, have a certain dignity that commands our respect. The reason the individual is sacred or the bearer of rights, according to Kant, doesn't stem from the idea that we own ourselves, but instead from the idea that we are all rational beings. We're all rational beings, which simply means that we are beings who are capable of reason. We are also autonomous beings, which is to say that we are beings capable of acting and choosing freely. Now, this capacity for reason and freedom isn't the only capacity we have. We also have the capacity for pain and pleasure, for suffering and satisfaction. Kant admits the utilitarians were half right. Of course, we seek to avoid pain, and we like pleasure. Kant doesn't deny this. What he does deny is Bentham's claim that pain and pleasure are our sovereign masters. He thinks that's wrong. Kant thinks that it's our rational capacity that makes us distinctive, that makes us special, that sets us apart from and above mere animal existence. It makes us something more than just physical creatures with appetites. Now, we often think of freedom as simply consisting in doing what we want, or in the absence of obstacles to getting what we want. That's one way of thinking about freedom. But this isn't Kant's idea of freedom. Kant has a more stringent, demanding notion of what it means to be free. And though it's stringent and demanding, if you think it through, it's actually pretty persuasive. Kant reasons as follows. When we, like animals, seek after pleasure, or the satisfaction of our desires, or the avoidance of pain, when we do that, we aren't really acting freely. Why not? We're really acting as the slaves of those appetites and impulses. I didn't choose this particular hunger or that particular appetite. And so when I act to satisfy it, I'm just acting according to natural necessity. And for Kant, freedom is the opposite of necessity. There was an advertising slogan for the soft drink Sprite a few years ago. The slogan was, "Obey your thirst." There's a Kantian insight buried in that Sprite advertising slogan. That, in a way, is Kant's point. When you go for Sprite or Pepsi, you might think that you're choosing freely Sprite versus Pepsi, but you're actually obeying something, a thirst, or maybe a desire manufactured or massaged by advertising. You're obeying a prompting that you yourself haven't chosen or created. And here, it's worth noticing Kant's specially demanding idea of freedom. What way of acting, how can my will be determined if not by the promptings of nature or my hunger or my appetite or my desires? Kant's answer, to act freely is to act autonomously. And to act autonomously is to act according to a law that I give myself, not according to the physical laws of nature or to the laws of cause and effect, which include my desire to eat or to drink or to choose this food in a restaurant over that. Now, what is the opposite? What is the opposite of autonomy? For Kant, he invents a special term to describe the opposite of autonomy. Heteronomy is the opposite of autonomy. When I act heteronomously, I'm acting according to an inclination or a desire that I haven't chosen for myself. So freedom as autonomy is the specially stringent idea that Kant insists on. Now, why is autonomy the opposite of acting heteronomously or according to the dictates of nature? Kant's point is that nature is governed by laws of cause and effect, for example. Suppose you drop a billiard ball. It falls to the ground. We wouldn't say the billiard ball is acting freely. Why not? It's acting according to the law of nature, according to the laws of cause and effect, the law of gravity. And just as he has an unusually demanding and stringent conception of freedom as autonomy, he also has a demanding conception of morality. To act freely is not to choose the best means to a given end. It's to choose the end itself for its own sake. And that's something that human beings can do and that billiard balls can't. Insofar as we act on inclination or pursue pleasure, we act as means to the realization of ends given outside us. We are instruments rather than authors of the purposes we pursue. That's the heteronymous determination of the will. On the other hand, insofar as we act autonomously, according to a law we give ourselves, we do something for its own sake, as an end in itself. When we act autonomously, we cease to be instruments to purposes given outside us. We become, or we can come to think of ourselves, as ends in ourselves. This capacity to act freely, Kant tells us, is what gives human life its special dignity. Respecting human dignity means regarding persons not just as means, but also as ends in themselves. And this is why it's wrong to use people for the sake of other people's well-being or happiness. This is the real reason, Kant says, that utilitarianism goes wrong. This is the reason it's important to respect the dignity of persons and to uphold their rights. So even if there are cases, remember John Stuart Mill said, well, in the long run, if we uphold justice and respect the dignity of persons, we will maximize human happiness. What would Kant's answer be to that? What would his answer be? Even if that were true, even if the calculus worked out that way, even if you shouldn't throw the Christians to the lions because in the long run, fear will spread, the overall utility will decline. The utilitarian would be upholding justice and rights and respect for persons for the wrong reason, for a purely contingent reason, for an instrumental reason. It would still be using people, even where the calculus works out for the best in the long run, it would still be using people as means rather than respecting them as ends in themselves. So, that's Kant's idea of freedom as autonomy, and you can begin to see how it's connected to his idea of morality. But we still have to answer one more question. What gives an act its moral worth in the first place? If it can't be directed at utility or satisfying wants and desires, what gives an action its moral worth? This leads us from Kant's demanding idea of freedom to his demanding idea of morality. What does Kant say? What makes an action morally worthy consists not in the consequences or in the results that flow from it. What makes an action morally worthy has to do with the motive, with the quality of the will, with the intention for which the act is done. What matters is the motive, and the motive must be of a certain kind. So, the moral worth of an action depends on the motive for which it's done, and the important thing is that the person do the right thing for the right reason. A good will isn't good because of what it affects or accomplishes, Kant writes. It's good in itself. Even if by its utmost effort the good will accomplishes nothing, it would still shine like a jewel for its own sake, as something which has its full value in itself. And so for any action to be morally good, it's not enough that it should conform to the moral law. It must also be done for the sake of the moral law. The idea is that the motive confers the moral worth on an action. And the only kind of motive that can confer moral worth on an action is the motive of duty. Well, what's the opposite of doing something out of a sense of duty because it's right? Well, for Kant, the opposite would be all of those motives having to do with our inclinations. And inclinations refer to all of our desires, all of our contingently given wants, preferences, impulses, and the like. Only actions done for the sake of the moral law, for the sake of duty, only these actions have moral worth. Now, I want to see what you think about this idea, but first let's consider a few examples. Kant begins with an example of a shopkeeper. He wants to bring out the intuition and make plausible the idea that what confers moral worth on an action is that it be done because it's right. He says, suppose there's a shopkeeper and an inexperienced customer comes in. The shopkeeper knows that he could give the customer the wrong change, could shortchange the customer and get away with it. At least that customer wouldn't know. But the shopkeeper nonetheless says, well, if I shortchange this customer, word may get out, my reputation would be damaged, and I would lose business. So I won't shortchange this customer. The shopkeeper does nothing wrong. He gives the correct change. But does his action have moral worth? Kant says no. It doesn't have moral worth because the shopkeeper only did the right thing for the wrong reason, out of self-interest. That's a pretty straightforward case. Then he takes another case, the case of suicide. He says we have a duty to preserve ourselves. Now, for most people who love life, we have multiple reasons for not taking our own lives. So the only way we can really tell, the only way we can isolate the operative motive for someone who doesn't take his or her life is to imagine someone who's miserable and who, despite having an absolutely miserable life, nonetheless recognizes the duty to preserve oneself and so does not commit suicide. That's the force of the example, is to bring out the motive that matters. And the motive that matters for morality is doing the right thing for the sake of duty. Let me just give you a couple of other examples. The Better Business Bureau. What's their slogan? The slogan of the Better Business Bureau? Honesty is the best policy. It's also the most profitable. This is the Better Business Bureau's full-page ad in the New York Times. Honesty. It's as important as any other asset, because a business that deals in truth, openness, and fair value cannot help but do well. Come join us and profit from it. What would Kant say about the moral worth of the honest dealings of members of the Better Business Bureau? What would he say? That here's a perfect example that if this is the reason that these companies deal honestly with their customers, their action lacks moral worth. This is Kant's point. Or a couple of years ago at the University of Maryland, there was a problem with cheating. And so they initiated an honor system. And they created a program with local merchants that if you signed the honor pledge, a pledge not to cheat, you would get discounts of 10 to 25% at local shops. Well, what would you think of someone motivated to uphold an honor code with the hope of discounts? It's the same as Kant's shopkeeper. The point is, what matters is the quality of the will, the character of the motive, and the relevant motive to morality can only be the motive of duty, not the motive of inclination. And when I act out of duty, when I resist as my motive for acting inclinations or self-interest, even sympathy and altruism, only then am I acting freely. Only then am I acting autonomously. Only then is my will not determined or governed by external considerations. That's the link between Kant's idea of freedom and of morality. Now, I want to pause here to see if all of this is clear, or if you have some questions or puzzles. They can be questions of clarification, or they can be challenges, if you want to challenge this idea that only the motive of duty confers moral worth on the action. What do you think? Yes?
Yeah, I actually have two questions of clarification. The first is, there seems to be an aspect of this that makes it sort of self-defeating, in that once you're conscious of what morality is, you can sort of alter your motive to achieve that end of morality. And secondly,
give me an example of what you have in mind.
The shopkeeper example, if he decides that he wants to give the person the money to do the right thing, and he decides that's his motive to do so because he wants to be moral, then isn't that sort of defeating isn't that sort of defeating the purity of his action if morality is determined by his motive? His motive is then to act morally.
So you're imagining a case not of the purely selfish calculating shopkeeper, but of one who says, well, he may consider shortchanging the customer, but then he says, not, well, my reputation might suffer if word gets out, but instead he says, actually, I would like to be the kind of honest person who gives the right change to customers simply because it's the right thing to do.
Or simply because I want to be moral.
Because I want to be moral. I want to be a good person. And so I'm going to conform all of my actions to what morality requires. It's a subtle point. It's a good question. Kant does acknowledge, you're pressing Kant on an important point here. Kant does say there has to be some incentive to obey the moral law. It can't be a self-interested incentive. That would defeat it by definition. So he speaks of a different kind of incentive from an inclination. He speaks of reverence for the moral law. So if that shopkeeper says, I want to develop a reverence for the moral law, and so I'm going to act, and so I'm going to do the right thing, then I think he's there. He's there as far as Kant's concerned. Because he's formed his motive, his will is conforming to the moral law once he sees the importance of it. So it would count. It would count.
All right, and then secondly, very quickly, what stops morality from becoming completely objective in this point?
What stops morality from becoming
completely subjective? Yeah, like how can, if morality is completely determined by your morals, then how can you apply this, or how can it be enforced?
That's also a great question. What's your name?
My name is Amadi.
Amadi?
Yeah.
All right. If acting morally means acting according to a moral law out of duty, and if it's also to act freely in the sense of autonomously, it must mean that I'm acting according to a law that I give myself. That's what it means to act autonomously. Amadi is right about that. But that does raise a really interesting question. If acting autonomously means acting according to a law I give myself, that's how I escape the chain of cause and effect and the laws of nature. What's to guarantee that the law I give myself when I'm acting out of duty is the same as the law that Amadi is giving himself, and that each of you gives yourselves. Well, here's the question. How many moral laws, from Kant's point of view, are there in this room? Are there 1,000 or is there one? He thinks there's one, which in a way does go back to this question, all right, what is the moral law? What does it tell us? So what guarantees? It sounds like it, to act autonomously is to act according to one's conscience, according to a law one gives oneself. But what guarantees that if we all exercise our reason, we will come up with one and the same moral law? That's what Amati wants to know. Here's Kant's answer. The reason that leads us to the law we give ourselves as autonomous beings is a reason, it's a kind of practical reason that we share as human beings. It's not idiosyncratic. The reason we need to respect the dignity of persons is that we're all rational beings. We all have the capacity for reason, and it's the exercise of that capacity for reason which exists undifferentiated in all of us that makes us worthy of dignity, all of us. And since it's the same capacity for reason, unqualified by particular autobiographies and life circumstances, it's the same universal capacity for reason that delivers the moral law. It turns out that to act autonomously is to act according to a law we give ourselves, exercising our reason, but it's the reason we share with everyone as rational beings, not the particular reasons we have given our upbringings, our particular values, our particular interests. It's pure practical reason, in Kant's terms, which legislates a priori, regardless of any particular contingent or empirical ends. Well, what moral law would that kind of reason deliver? What is its content? To answer that question, you have to read the groundwork, and we'll continue with that question next time. For Kant, morally speaking, suicide is on a par with murder. It's on a par with murder because what we violate when we take a life, when we take someone's life, ours or somebody else's, we use that person, we use a rational being, we use humanity as a means. And so we fail to respect humanity as an end. Today we turn back to Kant. Before we do, remember, this is the week by the end of which all of you will basically get Kant, figure out what he's up to. You're laughing. No, it will happen. Kant's groundwork is about two big questions. First, what is the supreme principle of morality? Second, how is freedom possible? Two big questions. Now, one way of making your way through this dense philosophical book is to bear in mind a set of oppositions or contrasts or dualisms that are related. Today I'd like to talk about them. Today we're going to answer the question, what, according to Kant, is the supreme principle of morality? And in answering that question, in working our way up to Kant's answer to that question, it will help to bear in mind three contrasts or dualisms that Kant sets out. The first, you remember, had to do with the motive according to which we act. And according to Kant, only one kind of motive is consistent with morality: the motive of duty, doing the right thing for the right reason. What other kind of motives are there? Kant sums them up in the category of inclination. Every time the motive for what we do is to satisfy a desire or a preference that we may have, to pursue some interest, we're acting out of inclination. Now, let me pause to see if, in thinking about the question of the motive of duty, the goodwill, see if any of you has a question about that much of Kant's claim. Or is everybody happy with this distinction? What do you think? Go ahead.
When you make that distinction between duty and inclination, is there ever any moral action ever? I mean, you could always kind of probably find some selfish motive, can't you?
Maybe very often people do have self-interested motives when they act. Kant wouldn't dispute that. But what Kant is saying is that insofar as we act morally, that is, insofar as our actions have moral worth, what confers moral worth is precisely our capacity to rise above self-interest and prudence and inclination and to act out of duty. Some years ago, I read about a spelling bee, and there was a young man who was declared the winner of the spelling bee, a kid named Andrew, 13 years old. The winning word, the word that he was able to spell, was echolalia. Does anyone know what echolalia is? What? Some type of flower? It's not some type of flower, no. It means the tendency to repeat, as in echo, to repeat what you've heard. Anyhow, he misspelled it, actually. But the judges misheard him. They thought he had spelled it correctly and awarded him the championship of the National Spelling Bee. And he went to the judges afterward and said, actually, I misspelled it. I don't deserve the prize. And he was regarded as a moral hero, and he was written up in the New York Times, Misspeller is a spelling bee hero. There's Andrew with his proud mother. But when he was interviewed afterwards, listen to this, when he was interviewed afterwards, he said, quote, "The judges said I had a lot of integrity." But then he added that part of his motive was, quote, "I didn't want to feel like a slime." All right, what would Kant say? Go ahead.
I guess it would depend on whether or not that was a marginal reason or the predominant reason in whether or not and why he decided to confess that he didn't actually spell the word correctly.
Good. And what's your name?
Vasco.
That's very interesting. Is there anyone else who has a view about this? Does this show that Kant's principle is too stringent, too demanding? What would Kant say about this? Yes.
I think that Kant actually says that it is the pure motivation that comes out of duty which gives the action moral worth. So it's like, for example, in this case, he might have more than one motive. He might have the motive of not feeling like a slime, and he might have the motive of doing the right thing for in and of itself, out of duty. And so, while there's more than one motivation going on there, does not mean that the action is devoid of moral worth just because he has one other motive. So, because the motive which involves duty is what gives it the moral worth.
Good. And what's your name?
Judith.
Well, Judith, I think that your account actually is true to Kant. It's fine to have sentiments and feelings that support doing the right thing, provided they don't provide the reason for acting.
Yeah.
So I think Judith actually has mounted a pretty good defense of Kant on this question of the motive of duty. Thank you. Now, let's go back to the three contrasts. It's clear at least what Kant means when he says that for an action to have moral worth, it must be done for the sake of duty, not out of inclination. But as we began to see last time, there's a connection between Kant's stringent notion of morality and his specially demanding understanding of freedom. And that leads us to the second contrast, the link between morality and freedom. The second contrast describes two different ways that my will can be determined, autonomously and heteronomously. And according to Kant, I'm only free when my will is determined autonomously, which means what? According to a law that I give myself. We must be capable, if we're capable of freedom as autonomy, we must be capable of acting according not to a law that's given or imposed on us, but according to a law we give ourselves. But where could such a law come from? A law that we give ourselves? Reason. If reason determines my will, then the will becomes the power to choose independent of the dictates of nature or inclination or circumstance. So, connected with Kant's demanding notions of morality and freedom is a specially demanding notion of reason. Well, how can reason determine the will? There are two ways, and this leads to the third contrast. Kant says there are two different commands of reason. And a command of reason, Kant calls an imperative. An imperative is simply an ought. One kind of imperative, perhaps the most familiar kind, is a hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives use instrumental reason. If you want X, then do Y. It's means ends reasoning. If you want a good business reputation, then don't shortchange your customers, word make it out. That's a hypothetical imperative. If the action would be good solely as a means to something else, Kant writes the imperative is hypothetical. If the action is represented as good in itself, and therefore as necessary for a will which of itself accords with reason, then the imperative is categorical. That's the difference between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical one. A categorical imperative commands categorically, which just means without reference to or dependence on any further purpose. And so you see the connection among these three parallel contrasts. To be free in the sense of autonomous requires that I act not out of a hypothetical imperative, but out of a categorical imperative. And so you see, by these three contrasts, Kant reasons his way, brings us up to his derivation of the categorical imperative? Well, this leaves us one big question. What is the categorical imperative? What is the supreme principle of morality? What does it command of us? Kant gives three versions, three formulations of the categorical imperative. I want to mention two and then see what you think of them. The first version, the first formula, he calls the formula of the universal law. Act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And by maxim, what does Kant mean? He means a rule that explains the reason for what you're doing, a principle. For example, promise keeping. Suppose I need money, I need $100, desperately. And I know I can't pay it back anytime soon. I come to you and make you a promise, a false promise, one I know I can't keep. Please give me $100 today, lend me the money, I will repay you next week. Is that consistent with the categorical imperative, that false promise? Kant says no. And the test, the way we can determine that the false promise is at odds with the categorical imperative is try to universalize it. Universalize the maxim upon which you're about to act. If everybody made false promises when they needed money, then nobody would believe those promises. There would be no such thing as a promise. And so there would be a contradiction. The maxim, universalized, would undermine itself. That's the test. That's how we can know that the false promise is wrong. Well, what about the formula of the universal law? You find it persuasive? What do you think? Go ahead.
I have a question about the difference between categoricalism and a hypothesis that if you're going to
between categorical and hypothetical
yeah.
imperatives.
Right. If you're going to act with a categorical imperative so that the maxim doesn't undermine itself, it sounds like I am going to do X because I want Y. I am going to not lie in dire need because I want the world to function in such a way that promises are kept.
I don't want to liquidate the practice of promises.
Right. It sounds like justifying a means by an ends.
It seems like an instance of consequentialist reasoning, you're saying.
Right.
And what's your name?
Tim.
Tim. Well, Tim, John Stuart Mill agreed with you. He made this criticism of Kant. He said, if I universalize the maxim and find that the whole practice of promise-keeping would be destroyed if universalized, I must be appealing somehow to consequences.
Right.
If that's the reason not to tell a false promise. So John Stuart Mill agreed with that criticism against Kant. But John Stuart Mill was wrong. You're in good company, though. You're in good company, Tim. Kant is often read, as Tim just read him, as appealing to consequences. The world would be worse off if everybody lied, because then no one could rely on anybody else's word. Therefore, you shouldn't lie. That's not what Kant is saying exactly, although it's easy to interpret him as saying that. I think what he's saying is that this is the test. This is the test of whether the maxim corresponds with the categorical imperative. It isn't exactly the reason. It's not the reason The reason you should universalize to test your maxim is to see whether you are privileging your particular needs and desires over everybody else's. It's a way of pointing to this feature, this demand of the categorical imperative, that the reasons for your action shouldn't depend, for their justification, on your interests, your needs, your special circumstances being more important than somebody else's. That, I think, is the moral intuition lying behind the universalization test. So let me spell out Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, perhaps in a way that's more intuitively accessible than the formula of universal law. It's the formula of humanity as an end. Kant introduces the second version of the categorical imperative with the following line of argument. We can't base the categorical imperative on any particular interests, purposes, or ends, because then it would be only relative to the person whose ends they were. But suppose there were something whose existence has in itself an absolute value, an end in itself, then in it, and in it alone, would there be the ground of a possible categorical imperative. Well, what is there that we can think of as having its end in itself? Kant's answer is this. I say that man, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in himself, not merely as a means for arbitrary use by this or that will. And here Kant distinguishes between persons on the one hand and things on the other. Rational beings are persons. They don't just have a relative value for us, but if anything they have an absolute value, an intrinsic value. That is, rational beings have dignity. They're worthy of reverence and respect. This line of reasoning leads Kant to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, which is this. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So that's the formula of humanity as an end. The idea that human beings, as rational beings, are ends in themselves, not open to use, merely as a means. When I make a false promise to you, I'm using you as a means to my ends, to my desire for the $100. And so I'm failing to respect you. I'm failing to respect your dignity. I'm manipulating you. Now consider the example of the duty against suicide. Murder and suicide are at odds with the categorical imperative. Why? If I murder someone, I'm taking their life for some purpose, either because I'm a hired killer or I'm in the throes of some great anger or passion. Well, I have some interest, some purpose that's particular, for the sake of which I'm using them as a means. Murder violates the categorical imperative. For Kant, morally speaking, suicide is on a par with murder. It's on a par with murder because what we violate when we take a life, when we take someone's life, ours or somebody else's, we use that person, we use a rational being, we use humanity as a means, and so we fail to respect humanity as an end. And that capacity for reason, that humanity that commands respect, that is the ground of dignity, that humanity, that capacity for reason, resides undifferentiated in all of us. And so I violate that dignity in my own person if I commit suicide, and in murder if I take somebody else's life. From a moral point of view, they're the same. And the reason they're the same has to do with the universal character and ground of the moral law. The reason that we have to respect the dignity of other people has not to do with anything in particular about them. And so respect, Kantian respect, is unlike love in this way. It's unlike sympathy. It's unlike solidarity or fellow feeling or altruism. Because love and those other particular virtues or reasons for caring about other people have to do with who they are in particular. But respect for Kant, respect is respect for humanity, which is universal, for a rational capacity which is universal. And that's why violating it, in my own case, is as objectionable as violating it in the case of any other. Questions or objections? Go ahead.
I guess I'm somewhat worried about Kant's statement that you cannot use a person as a means because every person is an end in and of themselves. Because it seems that every day, in order to get something accomplished for that day, I must use myself as a means to some end. And I must use the people around me as a means to some end as well. For instance, suppose that I want to do well in a class, and I have to write a paper. I have to use myself as a means to write the paper. Suppose I want to buy something, food. I must go to the store and use the person working behind the counter as a means for me to purchase my food.
Right. That's true. You do. What's your name?
Patrick.
Patrick, you're not doing anything wrong. You're not violating the categorical imperative when you use other people as means. That's not objectionable, provided when we deal with other people for the sake of advancing our projects and purposes and interests, which we all do, provided we treat them in a way that is consistent with respect for their dignity. And what it means to respect them is given by the categorical imperative. Are you persuaded? Do you think that Kant has given a compelling account, a persuasive account of the supreme principle of morality? Reread the groundwork, and we'll try to answer that question next time. Last time we began by trying to navigate our way through Kant's moral theory. Now, fully to make sense of Kant's moral theory in the groundwork requires that we be able to answer three questions. How can duty and autonomy go together? What's the great dignity in answering to duty? It would seem that these two ideas are opposed, duty and autonomy. What's Kant's answer to that? Need someone here to speak up on Kant's behalf. Does he have an answer? Yes, go ahead, stand up.
Kant believes that you only act autonomously when you are pursuing something only in the name of duty and not because of your own circumstances, such as, like, you're only doing something good and moral if you're doing it because of duty and not because of something of your own personal gain.
Now, why is that acting? What's your name?
Mine is Matt.
Matt, why is that acting out of freedom? I hear
Because
what you're saying
you
about duty.
choose to accept those moral laws on yourself, and they're not brought on from outside onto you.
Okay, good. Because acting out of duty
Yeah.
is following a moral law
That you impose on yourself.
that you impose on yourself. That's what makes duty compatible with freedom.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good, Matt. That is Kant's answer. That's great. Thank you. So, Kant's answer is, it is not insofar as I am subject to the law that I have dignity, but rather insofar as, with regard to that very same law, I'm the author, and I'm subordinated to that law on that grounds that I took it, as Matt just said, I took it upon myself. I willed that law. So that's why, for Kant, acting according to duty and acting freely, in the sense of autonomously, are one and the same. But that raises the question, how many moral laws are there? Because if dignity consists in being governed by a law that I give myself, what's to guarantee that my conscience will be the same as your conscience? Who has Kant's answer to that? Yes.
Because a moral law is not contingent upon subjective conditions. It would transcend all particular differences between people, and so would be a universal law. And in this respect, there would only be one moral law, because it would be
Right.
supreme.
That's exactly right. What's your name?
Kelly?
Kelly. So, Kelly, Kant believes that if we choose freely, out of our own consciences, the moral law, we're guaranteed to come up with one and the same moral law.
Yes.
And that's because when I choose, it's not me, Michael Sandel, choosing. It's not you, Kelly, choosing for yourself. What is it exactly? Who's doing the choosing? Who's the subject? Who's the agent who's doing the choosing?
Reason?
Well, reason,
Pure reason.
pure reason. And what you mean by pure reason is what exactly?
Well, pure reason is, like we were saying before, not subject to any external conditions that may be imposed on it.
Good.
So.
That's great. So the reason that does the willing, the reason that governs my will when I will the moral law, is the same reason that operates when you choose the moral law for yourself. And that's why it's possible to act autonomously, to choose for myself, for each of us to choose for ourselves as autonomous beings, and for all of us to wind up willing the same moral law, the categorical imperative. But then there is one big and very difficult question left. Even if you accept everything that Matt and Kelly have said so far, how is a categorical imperative possible? How is morality possible? To answer that question, Kant says we need to make a distinction. We need to make a distinction between two standpoints from which we can make sense of our experience. Let me try to explain what he means by these two standpoints. As an object of experience, I belong to the sensible world. There, my actions are determined by the laws of nature and by the regularities of cause and effect. But as a subject of experience, I inhabit an intelligible world. Here, being independent of the laws of nature, I am capable of autonomy, capable of acting according to a law I give myself. Now, Kant says that only from this second standpoint can I regard myself as free. For to be independent of determination by causes in the sensible world is to be free. If I were wholly an empirical being, as the utilitarians assume, if I were a being wholly and only subject to the deliverances of my senses, to pain and pleasure and hunger and thirst and appetite, if that's all there were to humanity, we wouldn't be capable of freedom, Kant reasons. Because in that case, every exercise of will would be conditioned by the desire for some object. In that case, all choice would be heteronymous choice, governed by the pursuit of some external end. When we think of ourselves as free, Kant writes, we transfer ourselves into the intelligible world as members and recognize the autonomy of the will. That's the idea of the two standpoints. So, how are categorical imperatives possible? Only because the idea of freedom makes me a member of an intelligible world. Now, Kant admits we aren't only rational beings. We don't only inhabit the intelligible world, the realm of freedom. If we did, then all of our actions would invariably accord with the autonomy of the will. But precisely because we inhabit simultaneously the two standpoints, the two realms, the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity, precisely because we inhabit both realms, there is always potentially a gap between what we do and what we ought to do, between is and ought. Another way of putting this point, and this is the point with which Kant concludes the groundwork, morality is not empirical. Whatever you see in the world, whatever you discover through science, can't decide moral questions. Morality stands at a certain distance from the world, from the empirical world. And that's why no science could deliver moral truth. Now, I want to test Kant's moral theory with the hardest possible case, a case that he raises, the case of the murderer at the door. Kant says that lying is wrong. We all know that. We've discussed why. Lying is at odds with the categorical imperative. A French philosopher, Benjamin Constant, wrote an article responding to the groundwork where he said this absolute prohibition on lying is wrong. It can't be right. What if a murderer came to your door looking for your friend who was hiding in your house, and the murderer asked you, point blank, is your friend in your house? Constant says it would be crazy to say that the moral thing to do in that case is to tell the truth. Constant says the murderer certainly doesn't deserve the truth. And Kant wrote a reply. And Kant stuck by his principle that lying, even to the murderer at the door, is wrong. And the reason it's wrong, he said, is once you start taking consequences into account to carve out exceptions to the categorical imperative, you've given up the whole moral framework. You've become a consequentialist, or maybe a rule utilitarian. But most of you, and most of Kant's readers, think there's something odd and implausible about this answer. I would like to try to defend Kant on this point, and then I want to see whether you think that my defense is plausible. And I would want to defend him within the spirit of his own account of morality. Imagine that someone comes to your door. You were asked the question by this murderer. You're hiding your friend. Is there a way that you could avoid telling a lie without selling out your friend? Does anyone have an idea of how you might be able to do that? Yes, stand up.
I was just going to say, if I were to let my friend in my house to hide in the first place, I'd probably make a plan with them. So I'd be like, hey, I'll tell the murderer you're here, but escape. And that's one of the options mentioned. So.
But I'm not sure that's a Kantian option. You're still lying, though.
No, because he's in the house, but he won't be.
Oh, I see. All right, good enough. One more try.
If you just say you don't know where he is because he might not be locked in the closet, he might have left the closet, you have no clue where he could be.
So you would say, I don't know, which wouldn't actually be a lie because you weren't at that very moment looking in the closet.
Exactly.
So it would be, strictly speaking, true.
Yes.
And yet possibly deceiving. Misleading.
But still true.
What's your name?
John.
John. All right, John has... now, John may be onto something. John, you're really offering us the option of a clever evasion that is, strictly speaking, true. This raises the question whether there is a moral difference between an outright lie and a misleading truth. From Kant's point of view, there actually is a world of difference between a lie and a misleading truth. Why is that? Even though both might have the same consequences. But then remember, Kant doesn't base morality on consequences. He bases it on formal adherence to the moral law. Now, sometimes in ordinary life, we make exceptions for the general rule against lying with a white lie. What is a white lie? It's a lie to avoid hurting someone's feelings, for example. It's a lie that we think of as justified by the consequences. Now, Kant could not endorse a white lie, but perhaps he could endorse a misleading truth. Suppose someone gives you a tie as a gift, and you open the box, and it's just awful. What do you say? Thank you? You could say thank you. But they're waiting to see what you think of it. Or they ask you, what do you think of it? You could tell a white lie and say, it's beautiful. But that wouldn't be permissible from Kant's point of view. Could you say, not a white lie, but a misleading truth? You open the box and you say, I've never seen a tie like that before. Thank you. You shouldn't have. That's good. Can you think of a contemporary political leader who engaged... You can? Who are you thinking of? Remember the whole carefully worded denials in the Monica Lewinsky affair of Bill Clinton. Now, those denials actually became the subject of very explicit debate and argument during the impeachment hearings. Take a look at the following excerpts from Bill Clinton. Is there something, do you think, morally at stake in the distinction between a lie and a misleading, carefully couched truth?
I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false.
Did he lie to the American people when he said, I never had sex with that woman?
You know, he doesn't believe he did, and because of the... Let me explain. May I explain, Congressman? What he said was to the American people that he did not have sexual relations. And I understand you're not going to like this, Congressman, because you will see it as a hair-splitting, evasive answer. But in his own mind, his definition was not...
Okay, I understand that argument.
Okay.
All right. So there you have the exchange. Now, at the time, you may have thought this was just a legalistic, hair-splitting exchange between a Republican who wanted to impeach Clinton and the lawyer who was trying to defend him. But now, in the light of Kant, do you think there is something morally at stake in the distinction between a lie and an evasion, a true but misleading statement? I'd like to hear from defenders of Kant, people who think there is a distinction. Are you ready to defend Kant?
Well, I think when you try to say that lying and misleading truths are the same thing, you're basing it on a consequentialist argument, which is that they achieve the same thing. But the fact of the matter is, you told the truth, and you intended that people would believe what you were saying, which was the truth, which means it is not morally the same as telling a lie and intending that they believe it is the truth, even though it's not true.
Good. What's your name?
Diana.
So Diana says that Kant has a point here. And it's a point that might even come to the aid of Bill Clinton. And that is, well, what about that? Someone over here.
For Kant, motivation is key. So if you give to someone because primarily you want to feel good about yourself, Kant would say that has no moral worth. Well, with this, the motivation is the same. It's to sort of mislead someone, it's to lie, it's to sort of throw them off the track, and the motivation is the same. So there should be no difference.
Okay, good. So here, isn't the motive the same, Diana? What do you say to this argument that, well, the motive is the same? In both cases, there is the attempt, or at least the hope, that one's pursuer will be misled.
Well, you could look at it that way, but I think that the fact is that your immediate motive is that they should believe you. The ultimate consequence of that is that they might be deceived and not find out what was going on. But your immediate motive is that they should believe you because you're telling the truth.
May I help a little?
Sure.
You and Kant. Why don't you say, and what's your name? I'm sorry.
Wesley.
Why don't you say to Wesley, it's not exactly the case that the motive in both cases is to mislead. They're hoping that the person will be misled by the statement, I don't know where they are, or I never had sexual relations. You're hoping that they will be misled, but in the case where you're telling the truth, your motive is to mislead while at the same time telling the truth and honoring the moral law and staying within the bounds of the categorical imperative. I think Kant's answer would be, Diana, yes? You like that?
I do.
Okay, so I think Kant's answer would be, unlike a falsehood, unlike a lie, a misleading truth pays a certain homage to duty. And the homage it pays to duty is what justifies that even the work of evasion. Diana, yes? You like? Okay. And so there is some element of respect for the dignity of the moral law in the careful evasion, because Clinton could have told an outright lie, but he didn't. And so I think Kant's insight here is in the carefully couched but true evasion, there is a kind of homage to the dignity of the moral law that is not present in the outright lie. And that, Wesley, is part of the motive. It's part of the motive. Yes, I hope he will be misled. I hope the murderer will run down the road or go to the mall looking for my friend instead of the closet. I hope that will be the effect. I can't control that. I can't control the consequences. But what I can control is standing by and honoring, however I pursue the ends I hope will unfold, to do so in a way that is consistent with respect for the moral law. Wesley, I don't think, is entirely persuaded, but at least this discussion brings out some of what's at stake, what's morally at stake in Kant's notion of the categorical imperative.
As long as any effort is involved, I would say that the contract is valid and it should take effect.
But why? What morally can you point to?
For example, two people agree to be married, and one suddenly calls the other in 2 minutes say, I changed my mind. Does the contract have obligation on both sides?
Well, I'm tempted to say no.
Fine.
Last time we talked about Kant's categorical imperative, and we considered the way he applied the idea of the categorical imperative to the case of lying. I want to turn briefly to one other application of Kant's moral theory, and that's his political theory. Now, Kant says that just laws arise from a certain kind of social contract. But this contract, he tells us, is of an exceptional nature. What makes the contract exceptional is that it's not an actual contract that happens when people come together and try to figure out what the Constitution should be. Kant points out that the contract that generates justice is what he calls an idea of reason. It's not an actual contract among actual men and women gathered in a constitutional convention. Why not? I think Kant's reason is that actual men and women gathered in a real constitutional convention would have different interests, values, aims, and there would also be differences of bargaining power and differences of knowledge among them. And so the laws that would result from their deliberations wouldn't necessarily be just, wouldn't necessarily conform to principles of right, but would simply reflect the differences of bargaining power, the special interests, the fact that some might know more than others about law or about politics. So Kant says a contract that generates principles of right is merely an idea of reason, but it has undoubted practical reality because it can oblige every legislator to frame his laws in such a way that they could have been produced by the united will of the whole nation. So Kant is a contractarian, but he doesn't trace the origin or the rightness of law to any actual social contract. This gives rise to an obvious question. What is the moral force of a hypothetical contract, a contract that never happened? That's the question we take up today. But in order to investigate it, we need to turn to a modern philosopher, John Rawls, who worked out in his book, A Theory of Justice, in great detail, an account of a hypothetical agreement as the basis for justice. Rawls's theory of justice, in broad outline, is parallel to Kant's in two important respects. Like Kant, Rawls was a critic of utilitarianism. Each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice, Rawls writes, that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests. The second respect in which Rawls's theory follows Kant's is on the idea that principles of justice, properly understood, can be derived from a hypothetical social contract, not an actual one. And Rawls works this out in fascinating detail with the device of what he calls the veil of ignorance. The way to arrive at the rights, the basic rights that we must respect, the basic framework of rights and duties, is to imagine that we were gathered together trying to choose the principles to govern our collective lives without knowing certain important particular facts about ourselves. That's the idea of the veil of ignorance. Now, what would happen if we gathered together, just as we are here, and tried to come up with principles of justice to govern our collective life? There would be a cacophony of proposals, of suggestions, reflecting people's different interests. Some are strong, some are weak. Some are rich, some are poor. So Rawls says, imagine instead that we are gathered in an original position of equality. And what assures the equality is the veil of ignorance. Imagine that we are all behind a veil of ignorance which temporarily abstracts from or brackets, hides from us who in particular we are. Our race, our class, our place in society, our strengths, our weaknesses, whether we're healthy or unhealthy. Then, and only then, Rawls says, the principles we would agree to would be principles of justice. That's how the hypothetical contract works. What is the moral force of this kind of hypothetical agreement? Is it stronger or weaker than a real agreement, an actual social contract? In order to answer that question, we have to look hard at the moral force of actual contracts. There are really two questions here. One of them is, how do actual contracts bind me or obligate me? Question number one. And question number two, how do actual, real-life contracts justify the terms that they produce? If you think about it, this is in line with Rawls and Kant, the answer to the second question, how do actual contracts justify the terms that they produce, the answer is they don't. At least not on their own. Actual contracts are not self-sufficient moral instruments. Of any actual contract or agreement, it can always be asked, is it fair what they agreed to? The fact of the agreement never guarantees the fairness of the agreement. And we know this by looking at our own constitutional convention. It produced a constitution that permitted slavery to persist. It was agreed to, it was an actual contract, but that doesn't establish that the laws agreed to, all of them, were just. Well, then what is the moral force of actual contracts? To the extent that they bind us, they obligate in two ways. Suppose, maybe here it would help to take an example. We make an agreement a commercial agreement. I promise to pay you $100 if you will go harvest and bring to me 100 lobsters. We make a deal. You go out and harvest them and bring them to me. I eat the lobsters, serve them to my friends, and then I don't pay. And you say, but you're obligated. And I say, why? What do you say? Well, we had a deal. And you benefited. You ate all those lobsters. Well, that's a pretty strong argument. It's an argument that depends, though, on the fact that I benefited from your labor. So, contracts sometimes bind us insofar as they are instruments of mutual benefit. I ate the lobsters, I owe you the $100 for having gathered them. But suppose, now take a second case, we make this deal, I'll pay you $100 for 100 lobsters, and 2 minutes later, before you've gone to any work, I call you back and say, I've changed my mind. Now, there's no benefit, there's no work on your part, so there's no element of reciprocal exchange. What about in that case? Do I still owe you? Merely in virtue of the fact that we had an agreement? Who says, those of you who say, yes, I still owe you? Why? Okay, stand up. Why do I owe you? I call you back. After 2 minutes, you haven't done any work.
I think I spent the time and effort in drafting this contract with you, and also have emotional expectation that I'll go through the work.
So you took time to draft the contract, but we did it very quickly. We just chatted on the phone.
That wouldn't be a formal form of contract, though.
Well, I faxed it to you. It only took a minute.
As long as any effort is involved, I would say that the contract is valid and it should take effect.
But why? What morally can you point to that obligates me? I admit that I agreed, but you didn't go to any work. I didn't enjoy any benefit.
Because one might mentally go through all the work of harvesting the lobsters.
You mentally went through the work of harvesting the lobsters. That's nothing, is it? It's not much. Is it worth $100 that you were imagining yourself going and collecting lobsters?
It may not worth $100, but it may worth something to some people.
All right, I'll give you $1 for that. But so you're still pointing, what's interesting, you're still pointing to the reciprocal dimension of contracts. You did or imagined that you did or looked forward to doing something on my behalf.
For example, two people agree to be married and one suddenly calls the other and in 2 minutes say, I've changed my mind. Does the contract have obligation on both sides? Nobody has paid any work or nobody has benefited yet.
Well, I'm tempted to say no.
Fine.
All right. What's your name?
Julian.
Thank you, Julian. All right. That was good. Now, is there anyone who agrees with Julian that I still owe the money? For any other reason now, go ahead. Stand up.
I think if you back out, it sort of cheapens the institution of contracts.
Good, but why? Why does it?
Well, I think this is kind of Kantian, but there's a certain intrinsic value in being able to make contracts and having, knowing that people will expect that you'll go through with that.
Good. It would cheapen the whole idea of contracts, which has to do with taking an obligation on myself. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think so.
What's your name?
Adam.
So Adam points instead not to any reciprocal benefit or mutual exchange, but to the mere fact of the agreement itself. we see here there are really two different ways in which actual contracts generate obligations. One has to do with the act of consent as a voluntary act. And it points, Adam said this was a Kantian idea, and I think he's right, because it points to the ideal of autonomy. When I make a contract, the obligation is one that is self-imposed. And that carries a certain moral weight, independent of other considerations. And then there's a second element of the moral force of contract arguments, which has to do with the sense in which actual contracts are instruments of mutual benefit, and this points toward the ideal of reciprocity, that obligation can arise, I can have an obligation to you, insofar as you do something for me. Now, we're investigating the moral force and also the moral limits of actual contracts. And here I would like to advance an argument about the moral limits of actual contracts. Now that we know what moral ingredients do the work when people come together and say, I will do this if you do that. I would like to argue first that the fact that two people agree to some exchange does not mean that the terms of their agreement are fair. When my two sons were young, they collected baseball cards and traded them. And there is a 2-year age difference between them, and so I had to institute a rule about the trades that no trade was complete until I had approved it. And the reason is obvious. The older one knew more about the value of these cards, and so would take advantage of the younger one. So that's why I had to review it to make sure that the agreements were fair. Now you may say, well, this is paternalism. Of course it was. That's what paternalism is for, that kind of thing. So what does this show? What does the baseball card example show? The fact of an agreement is not sufficient to establish the fairness of the terms. I read some years ago of a case in Chicago. There was an elderly widow, an 84-year-old widow named Rose, who had a problem in her apartment with a leaky toilet. And she signed a contract with an unscrupulous contractor who offered to repair her leaky toilet in exchange for $50,000. But she had agreed. She was of sound mind, maybe terribly naive and unfamiliar with the price of plumbing. She had made this agreement. Luckily, it was discovered. She went to the bank and asked to withdraw $25,000. And the teller said, what do you need all of that money for? And she said, well, I have a leaky toilet. And the teller called authorities, and they discovered this unscrupulous contractor. Now, I suspect that even the most ardent contractarians in the room will agree that the fact of this woman's agreement is not a sufficient condition of the agreement being fair. Is there anyone who will dispute that? No one. Am I missing anyone? Alex, where are you? Where are you? So maybe there's no dispute then to my first claim that an actual agreement is not necessary to it's not a sufficient condition of there being an obligation. I want to now make a stronger, maybe more controversial claim about the moral limits of actual contracts, that a contract or an act of consent is not only not sufficient, but it's not even a necessary condition of there being an obligation. And the idea here is that if there is reciprocity, if there is an exchange, then a receipt of benefits, there can be an obligation even without an act of consent. One great example of this involves the 18th century philosopher, the Scottish moral philosopher David Hume. When he was young, Hume wrote a book arguing against Locke's idea of an original social contract. Hume heaped scorn on this contractarian idea. He said it was a philosophical fiction, one of the most mysterious and incomprehensible operations that can possibly be imagined, this idea of the social contract. Many years later, when he was 62 years old, Hume had an experience that put to the test his rejection of consent as the basis of obligation. Hume had a house in Edinburgh. He rented it to his friend, James Boswell, who in turn sublet it to a subtenant. The subtenant decided that the house needed some repairs and a paint job. He hired a contractor to do the work. The painter did the work and sent the bill to Hume. Hume refused to pay on the grounds that he hadn't consented. He hadn't hired the painter. The case went to court. The contractor said, "It's true, Hume didn't agree, but the house needed a painting, and I gave it a very good one." Hume thought this was a bad argument. The only argument this painter makes is that the work was necessary to be done, but this is no good answer because by the same rule, this painter may go through every house in Edinburgh and do what he thinks proper to be done without the landlord's consent and give the same reason, that the work was necessary and that the house was the better for it. So Hume didn't like the theory that there could be obligation to repay a benefit without consent, but the defense failed and he had to pay. Let me give you one other example of the distinction between the consent-based aspect of obligations and the benefit-based aspect, and how they're sometimes run together. This is based on a personal experience. Some years ago, I was driving across the country with some friends, and we found ourselves in the middle of nowhere in Hammond, Indiana. We stopped at a rest stop and got out of the car, and when we came back, our car wouldn't start. None of us knew much about cars. We didn't really know what to do until we noticed that in the parking lot, driving up next to us, was a van, and on the side it said Sam's Mobile Repair Van. And out of the van came a man, presumably Sam, and he came up to us and he said, "Can I help you? Here's how I work. I work by the hour for $50 an hour. If I fix your car in 5 minutes, you owe me the $50. And if I work on your car for an hour and can't fix it, you'll still owe me the $50. So I said, "Well, what is the likelihood that you'll be able to fix the car?" And he didn't answer, but he did start poking around under the steering column. Short time passed. He emerged from under the steering column and said, "There's nothing wrong with the ignition system, but you still have 45 minutes left. Should I look under the hood?" I said, "Wait a minute. I haven't hired you. We haven't made any agreement." And then he became very angry, and he said, "Do you mean to say that if I had fixed your car while I was working under the steering column, that you wouldn't have paid me?" And I said, "That's a different question." I didn't go into the distinction between consent-based and benefit-based obligations. But I think he had the intuition that if he had fixed it while he was poking around, that I would have owed him the $50. I shared that intuition. I would have. But he inferred from that, this was the fallacy in the reasoning that I think lay behind his anger, he inferred from that fact that therefore, implicitly, we had an agreement. But that, it seems to me, is a mistake. It's a mistake that fails to recognize the distinction between these two different aspects of contract arguments. Yes, I agree I would have owed him $50 if he had repaired my car during that time. Not because we had made any agreement, we hadn't. But simply because if he had fixed my car, he would have conferred on me a benefit for which I would have owed him in the name of reciprocity and fairness. So here's another example of the distinction between these two different kinds of arguments, these two different aspects of the morality of contract. Now, I want to hear how many think I was in the right in that case. That's reassuring. Is there anyone who thinks I was in the wrong? Anyone? You do? Why? Go ahead.
Isn't the problem with this is that any benefit is inherently subjectively defined? I mean, what if you wanted your car broken and he had fixed it? I mean...
No, I didn't want it broken.
Yeah, in this case. I mean...
Who would?
I don't know, someone. I mean, what if Hume, what if the painter had painted his house blue, but he hated the color blue? I mean... You have to sort of define what your benefit is before the person does it.
Well, all right. So what would you conclude from that, though, for the larger issue here? Would you conclude that, therefore, consent is a necessary condition of there being an obligation?
Absolutely.
You would? What's your name?
Nate.
Because otherwise, how can we know, Nate says, whether there has been an exchange of equivalent or fair benefits, unless we have the subjective valuation, which may vary one person to the next of the situation. All right, that's a fair challenge. Let me put to you one other example in order to test the relation between these two aspects of the morality of contract. Suppose I get married, and suppose I discover that after 20 years of faithfulness on my part, every year, on our trip across the country, my wife has been seeing another man. A man with a van on the Indiana toll road. This part is completely made up, by the way. Wouldn't I have two different reasons for moral outrage? One reason could be we had an agreement. She broke her promise, referring to the fact of her consent. But I would also have a second ground for moral outrage, having nothing to do with the contract as such. But I've been so faithful for my part. Surely I deserve better than this. Is this what I'm due in return? And so on. So that would point to the element of reciprocity. Each reason has an independent moral force. That's the general point. And you can see this if you imagine a slight variation on the marriage case. Suppose we hadn't been married for 20 years. Suppose we were just married and that the betrayal occurred on the way to our honeymoon in Hammond, Indiana. After the contract has been made, but before there is any history of performance on my part. Performance of the contract, I mean. I would still, oh, come on. I would still, with Julian, I'd be able to say, but you promised. You promised. That would isolate the pure element of consent, right? Where there were no benefit, never mind. You get the idea. Here's the main idea. have their moral force in virtue of two distinguishable ideals, autonomy and reciprocity. But in real life, every actual contract may fall short, may fail to realize the ideals that give contracts their moral force in the first place. The ideal of autonomy may not be realized because there may be a difference in the bargaining power of the parties. The ideal of reciprocity may not be realized because there may be a difference of knowledge between the parties. And so they may misidentify what really counts as having equivalent value. Now, suppose you were to imagine a contract where the ideals of autonomy and of reciprocity were not subject to contingency, but were guaranteed to be realized. What kind of contract would that have to be? Imagine a contract among parties who were equal in power and knowledge rather than unequal, who were identically situated rather than differently situated. That is the idea behind Rawls's claim that the way to think about justice is from the standpoint of a hypothetical contract behind a veil of ignorance that creates a condition of equality by ruling out or enabling us to forget for the moment the differences in power and knowledge that could, even in principle, lead to unfair results. This is why, for Kant and for Rawls, a hypothetical contract among equals is the only way to think about principles of justice. What will those principles be? That's the question we'll turn to next time.